We are back, video number 20. So if you haven't seen every single video before, you definitely should go and start from video 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and work your way up. Last time we talked about red light therapy and things like that, and we're going to transition into cold exposure. So what is cold exposure, and what has made it so popular lately? Because we see more and more people buying ice bath, doing cold showers, and so on and so forth. What is the reasoning for that, and where did it even come from? I mean, and just dissecting everything after that.
Yeah, so as far as where did it come from? How did it get popular? I mean, this isn't like, I don't really know why it's so popular right at the moment, other than people seeing benefits from it, right? Hey, if you're getting benefits from it and you go tell your friend, they're going to try it. So the fact that it's so popular probably actually gives it credit other than more than most people would think, as far as like, hey, this is actually pretty effective at some of the things that it does. And then somebody who's done it for a long time and people just aren't really giving him credit now is Wim Hof, right? The Iceman. Um, and he's actually published the actual experiments that he went through and demonstrated physiological changes with cold exposure. So this isn't really made up. There's actual hard evidence done by him, specifically on him. So the benefits range really wide. They range from improving all kinds of biological process and all kinds of mental processes directly with neurotransmitters like dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and things of that nature. Now, the reason why it works, that is something that he really hasn't touched on, but we'll touch on it a little bit here, and that's the following. The previous episode had to do with like red light therapy and how you want to supplement it when you're not getting a lot of sunlight, or you work off hours, or you just live in a place on the planet where sunlight is lacking in the wintertime and stuff like that. You can supplement it with some red light therapy. But in all of the previous videos, we've always harped on, hey, you just need to get outside. And that is also relevant to cold exposure because of this kind of fact. Some people might not call it a fact, but it's evolution, right? Hey, there are certain things that we've evolved from. Everybody kind of understands that there used to be dinosaurs and stuff like that, and something killed them, right? Most people, scientists, agree that it was an asteroid that hit the planet and kicked up a bunch of how would I say clouds. Basically, think of it like a big nuclear bomb or several of them going off all at once, and it made it so that the sunlight went away or got severely diminished. So think of it like perpetual winter on the planet. What does that mean? It means that plants died off. It means that a lot of things died off that depended heavily on sunlight. Everything that survived from that point forward had two things in common. They had a lot of mitochondrial density, so that's mammals and theropod dinosaurs, which are now birds. Okay. Birds and mammals have the most mitochondrial density of all animals. And the thing that gives them the advantage is your body developed, and I don't mean like human bodies, I just mean like biological bodies develop the ability to function without sunlight or with very poor light conditions. So everybody understands that circadian rhythm, it's a big buzzword, popular word, we've even said it here, right, is the thing that coordinates all biological processes. And the main driving factor under normal circumstances is sunlight. But when sunlight is lacking, if you induce enough cold exposure through your cold receptors on your skin, your central climactic nucleus, which is the main circadian clock of the whole body, switches. It switches and makes light less dominant for biological processes and induces cold as the main driver. Okay. And the reason why it does that is because everybody that's been like, well, it might not even be people on this in this particular demographic, but anybody who has worked outside knows this. So people that work in construction, fishermen, oil field workers, people that work outside dominantly know these two things. It's the coldest right before sunrise, and it's the coldest right before sunset. Okay. That was picked up by your biology millions of years ago. So if it has a hard time telling when sunrise and sunset happens, it goes, okay, we're going to bypass that and we're going to make the switch to cold, because we know that even though we can't see the sun, we know that the temperature gets the coldest when the sun comes up and the temperature gets the coldest when the sun goes down. So now it starts to tie your biological processes, your circadian rhythm, to cold. Hey, when your body senses extra cold, it knows that either the sun rose or the sun set. And it sets timers. It goes, hey, if I get you cold in the morning, or I experience cold in the morning, and then a certain amount of time goes by and I experience another cold snap, it starts to entrain your biological processes to be in a rhythm with that, because the crucial part is just being in a rhythm. Hey, certain processes happen in coordination with others. Nothing ever happens by itself. That is the key factor. That's the key component of any circadian rhythm. And your body has historically used light, but it can also use cold. And that's the key to how cold exposure starts to benefit you. Do you have any like questions that come up or
So
anything like that as
how
far
does
as
cold exposure actually affect your physiology? So let's say you wake up in the morning and have a cold shower. Will it have same effect as
okay.
if you have a cold shower at night?
It won't, but they will affect the same systems, right? So we've talked a little bit about, hey, thyroid production, when you use sunlight in the morning, it changes. That's the key driver that changes T4 into T3. It starts to set the switch. Well, in the morning, cold exposure, even if, let's say it's just dark outside because you live somewhere where it's winter, but you go outside first thing in the morning or you take a cold shower, that is going to be a noradrenaline response that then turns into adrenaline, that then can spill over into dopamine, and then backwards, back and forth. They kind of interchange with each other. That little interaction there starts to trip the system, your central climactic nucleus, into going, oh, this must be morning time. So the same biological processes that was then associated with sun exposure starts to become associated with cold exposure. So in the morning, when you first wake up, exposing yourself to cold will bump up cortisol production, which means that now you're more awake and ready for activity. Noradrenaline will come up and dopamine will start to rise. So you literally start to feel a little bit more euphoric. You start to feel a little bit more like, hey, I can do whatever that, you start to feel a lot more mental capacity right off the bat. Cold exposure is just as potent as morning sunlight exposure when you start to make it a habit, in terms of just getting you ready for the day. So that's the easiest way, without getting into a whole lot of biological technical jargon, of how to explain how cold starts to benefit you just like morning sunlight. The people that wouldn't have to worry about this would be like people around the equator, right? Like it's 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of sunlight. And when the sun comes up, it's already very strong, right? So you're going to get that dopaminergic effect. You're going to get that adrenaline, the cortisol response and noradrenaline response. The moment you go outside, because the sun is up, you can get that same manifestation with cold exposure. So if you happen to live a life in a place on the planet where for 3-4 months out of the year, you only have like 8 hours of sunlight or 6 hours of sunlight, well, then you can start to use cold as your morning routine, and then just red light therapy in conjunction with the cold exposure to do a couple things. Have I lost you anywhere there as far as like
No, no,
things
no,
to
no,
go
no.
off of?
So what is the difference at night? So is there a
Yeah.
difference?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yep. So then you do the same thing. So viewing evening daylight or evening outside exposure starts to set up processes like, hey, there's lack of light, and that means that melatonin will now be able to be released and become the active form in the brain to start making you sleepy. And then the other uh, natural biological processes of releasing T4 once you go to sleep and releasing growth hormone once you go to sleep. Those types of things will start to get activated cold in the evening, as long as your environment gets dim. So in other words, even in the winter, on the cloudiest, snowiest day, it's still brighter than the the nighttime, right? And infrared light penetrates clouds. Okay, so this is where infrared light and cold complement each other. Okay, if you're somebody that spends a lot of time indoors, that's just your job. Cold exposure complemented with red light therapy while you're awake basically simulates that you're during that it's daytime. Okay, at the biological level. Okay, so then you remove the red light therapy at night and make sure that your lights are nice and dim, even go outside, something like that, and do some cold exposure. Now you've flipped the switch. You've essentially told your body through biological means that it is in fact nighttime. And the cold exposure at that point in time, with the removal of red light and other external light sources, literally makes you sleepy. Anybody that's gotten cold, especially when they're out skiing and stuff like that, they get done in the afternoon and the light has started to dim and they've been cold for the day. They come in and they're like, holy shit, I feel like I could just pass out right now. And some people in fact do, like they just go right into their cabin. You know, if they've gone on a winter vacation, they go into their cabin, they throw on a fireplace, and they'll pass out. The reason for that is because cold is very powerful at inducing that level of recovery. And it'll probably be the best sleep you ever have if you ever have the opportunity to go on a winter vacation and you're outside and getting cold all day long. When you come into a cabin or something, as long as it is fire. So fire is the only exception when it comes to light. Fire and red light boxes will not interfere with this process, but fake lighting like blue lights and artificial lighting of other kinds, screens, will interfere with that induction of telling your body that it's time to sleep. So it will improve sleep drastically when you make sure that you dim lighting and subtract artificial lighting, to be specific.
So what it looks basically, cold exposure is something that naturally has been happening for thousands, millennia years. How did it came about into improving athletic performance, overall well-being? We know there are some psychological benefits as well. So what can you actually extrapolate from that into practice of having a cold exposure after training in the middle of the day, for example?
Yes, so this is probably not very well known by a lot of people, but there's some very popular athletes, very, how would I say, extreme athletes that did some really extreme things that use this big time to their advantage. Uh, Armstrong, okay, the bicyclist, and Phelps, okay. Phelps is very secretive. He didn't train with anyone, okay, not even his team. There was a reason for that. His secret is his pool that he trained in was kept at 50 degrees because training in the cold, especially when it comes to aerobic capacity, gets amplified tenfold. And this just comes back to engine thermodynamics, right? So a jet engine, right, at sea level is not very efficient at all. It's actually very poorly efficient. But the moment it gets to 30,000 feet, guess what? The temperature outside is negative degrees. Now that engine can function and burn fuel way more efficiently. That happens at the microscopic level in your engines, your mitochondria. Your mitochondria are your engines. They're extremely sensitive, very efficient engines. And one of the things they take advantage at the molecular level is cold thermodynamics when it comes to engine functioning. So cold for performance is a game changer if you can figure out ways to train in the cold, so that then when you essentially VO2 max goes through the roof when you train in the cold. I keep wanting to call him Neil Armstrong, but that's the astronaut. What's his name? Armstrong.
Lance Armstrong.
Lance. That's right, Lance. Um, Lance Armstrong used to train in a fridge. Okay, so he hired out like a butcher shop fridge where he could put his bike in there, his stationary bike, and train in there for some of his training. And then Michael Phelps would do a pool. He would just have a temperature controlled pool where he could do his majority of his training in the cold, specifically to ramp up their VO2 max. It gives you the ability to eat through a shit ton of food and just recover from training consistently, especially aerobic training, because it's very inflammatory, right? And cold lowers inflammation. It directly lowers certain cytokines that have to do with inflammation. One very specific one is interleukin-6. And if you have less inflammation, now you can recover from training better. And the training is more efficient because your engines are functioning in a better thermodynamic environment. So you can burn fuel cleaner. Okay. So you're burning fuel cleaner, you're causing less inflammation, and the cold itself lowers inflammatory markers. So now you become a training robot, essentially. So that is, from a performance benefit, this is something that is guarded by really high-end professionals, but it's not that hard to understand, right? Like, oh, okay, this is an actual benefit.
Would this be
And this actually
beneficial
comes from
also for somebody who's doing a strength training, hypertrophy type of training, where they don't really push themselves as hard?
Yes, depending on, so it wouldn't be something like these athletes that I specifically mentioned. This was more of like in the background all the time type of training. And for strength athletes or people who just want to build more muscle, it would be more in line of periodized specifically for their goal. And what I mean by that is I wouldn't introduce this in the beginning of training cycles, because we do want some inflammatory markers to be raised. We do want some damage to be done. But once you get into like the grind of like, hey, week 4 all the way into, if you normally have to like pull back on training 3 or 4 weeks into your training block, well, around that time you start introducing cold while you train and after, or I would do it before, actually. I would do it before you train and during training. Then what you'll start to do is you'll start to feel like you're recovering better. And you, in fact, are, because you're reducing these inflammatory markers. And now you can extend training out. So specifically for right off the bat, things like powerlifting and strongman come to mind, because those are, some of the events are technical in nature. In other words, you will only get better at them by performing them more and more often, or you will get exponentially better, I should say, if you perform them more and more often.
Would you be brave enough
this,
and push this to saying that this is the reason why Eastern Europeans, Canadians are bigger and stronger than most population?
Well, it certainly has something to do with it, especially if their training environment is traditionally cold, and more importantly, what happens after their training, right? So if they're, they live in an environment that's predominantly cold, they almost can't get away from it, right? So when they do train, they, 2 or 3 hours later, they have to go outside for other things. They have to get cold exposure in some other ways. So they are immediately going to start lowering inflammation at certain times of the day after training. That's beneficial, because you don't like training. You want some inflammation in and around training, but your job after training should be to recover from that training. That includes food, that includes sleep, that also includes modalities that reduce inflammation. And cold happens to do that very, very well. So yeah, it could definitely be that.
Would it be smarter for someone who has exposure, let's say ice bath at home or something like that, to really amplify their training progress, to not do it every single time they train, but do it, let's say, a couple of weeks of their training block, whatever periodization looks like for them? Would you say, hey, every 6 weeks or so, do 4 weeks of this, then forget about your cold exposure again, let your body you start new training blocks, let your body go through all the adaptations at the beginning that needs to happen, and then start exposing yourself to cold once you start picking the pace up. everything is a little bit easier, but gets more intense. Would that be the right thing to do?
Yes, that would be the right thing to do in regards to what you mentioned there, as far as like an ice bath, because an ice bath is probably like the most aggressive form of cold exposure, right? Because you can quickly drop internal body temperature. So this is probably a good time to kind of talk about the different types of cold exposure
Yeah.
and how you can kind of have these played in the background. So cold exposure number one, that's super easy to do, that I think you should do irrelevant, as long as you don't live in the equator. Although you could kind of, it becomes more complicated in a warm climate, but the easiest way to get this type of benefit and take it to your advantage that doesn't affect training in a negative way is going to be just simply going outside. Because if the temperature is less than 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm not really sure what that is in Celsius, but 60 degrees Fahrenheit, if the temperature outside is less than that, you're going to get some benefit from just stepping outside. And that's the basic level of cold exposure. And doing that daily at any point in time during your training, basically year round, is going to be beneficial, because it's telling your body information about your environment. It's telling it a lot of information about your environment. So that's like the basic level of cold exposure. The next step up from that would be like a 3 to 5 minute cold shower. And what that, and that's both of these, what they do is they just lower skin temperature. They don't lower core temperature. And by lowering skin temperature, then the signal of melanocytes and things of that, and cold receptors on the skin, are what's going to amplify the cognitive benefits that you get from cold exposure. So amplifying noradrenaline production, dopamine production, cortisol production, kind of leveling all of that out. You will get all of those benefits from just stepping outside if the temperature outside is cold enough, or taking a short cold shower. And I think that is beneficial just year round. Then the more aggressive forms of cold exposure, like an ice bath or cryotherapy, that's the, I'm not a big fan of cryotherapy, just because in order to really get the benefits, you do want to be in there a little longer than they recommend, but most people can't be monitored very specifically. So I'd rather just use a cold bath, with an ice bath, or, if you live somewhere that it's already cold, just running really cold water is good enough. And that, because you can sit in there for a lot longer period of time and your whole body is exposed to water at once, that can, after about 10 to 15 minutes, it'll start to lower your internal body temperature a little bit at a time. When you get to that point, that's when inflammation markers really start to go down. But that's where it can be counterproductive for training if you're doing it too often. So that's like the next level of cold exposure: ice baths and cryotherapy. Those should not be used year round all the time. Those should be periodized with your training. And those
So
are
when you
be,
say don't use all year round, what would be negative implications of that?
So if you blunt inflammation too much, specifically, this is in regards to weight training and creating bigger muscles. And so this is going to mainly apply to strongman, powerlifters, things of that nature, right? Like where you're actively trying to grow more and more all the time. It will blunt inflammation to the point where you get a slightly diminished return on your efforts in the gym if you're doing it all the time.
I think the easiest
Sure.
I can put it is, imagine you are having a child and he learns something and he does something wrong and you fix it instead of teach them how to do that. They never learn that. They just helpless. So your body pretty much, if you keep that extreme cold exposure and just dumping down, hey, nothing happened, your body never gets better.
That's right. That's 100% right. But eventually, right, like there's, if you're, especially if you're leading into a competition, you're going to have to go there, right? Like, as far as like, hey, I'm going to have to intensify some of my methods in order to get the response that I'm looking for. And the consequence of some of those methods might be a little more inflammation that you can actually recover from. And that's where I'd rather use cold exposure than ibuprofen or other anti-inflammatories, because the cold exposure not only will blunt those probably better than those medications, it will also add benefits, right? Because it will amplify metabolism a little bit. It will also bring something that we haven't even touched on, is mental fortitude. Okay, because when you first jump into a cold shower, even, your breath is going to be taken away. You're going to start to hyperventilate. You're going to have to learn to control your breath and control your autonomics in order to survive 10 minutes in an ice bath without having a panic attack, right? So right off the bat, you start using this is what I call deep cold thermogenesis, which is the ice baths. You start using that also as a mental training tool of like, hey, I'm going to get my breath under control. I'm going to get in here. I'm going to start regulating my own heart rate. I'm not going to let my body get out of control. My mind is going to control my body, right? So now this directly transfers to performance on the platform or performance on the field, as far as like your mind being in control of your body, not the other way around. And so that's why I'm like, okay, this has lots of potentials when it comes to amplifying training and recovery from training, but also its own training itself for your brain.
So is there a difference for, let's say, different body systems, body types, somebody who can't tolerate, let's say he's insulin resistant and so on and so forth?
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought
What's
that
happening
up.
there? So somebody is extremely fit and somebody who's just figured out, hey, I need to sort my life out, but all my blood is a mess. I'm insulin resistant, maybe type 2 diabetic or whatever else there is. What is the difference between those type of scenarios?
Yeah. So for people that are metabolically compromised, that covers everything from insulin resistance, which automatically means they're leptin resistant, um, things of that nature. Cold is extremely beneficial for these people in regards to all of the specifically we'll talk about insulin resistance, because this is something that I see all the time. Insulin resistance is going to be causing way more inflammation than necessary just from the foods you're eating. Okay, so you can use cold to your advantage to lower C-reactive protein, which is one of the blood markers that we've talked, early on in our episodes, and things of that nature. So you start to undo a lot of the negatives from being insulin resistant with cold exposure. And if you kind of think about it from a biological evolutionary standpoint, cold exposure is actually the thing that undoes insulin resistance when you can do it frequently enough. So the best example that I have is all mammals had at one point in time the capability of hibernation. We as humans have lost that, but essentially it looks like this. We'll talk about bears because people know that bears hibernate. When bears start their hibernation process, it happens in the fall, which is when sunlight starts to diminish and cold temperatures start to come up a little bit, but there's still carbohydrates around. So they eat these carbohydrates and they are insulin resistant. When you are insulin resistant, when you consume carbohydrates, they do not go to glycogen storage. They go to making triglycerides so that you can store them as body fat. That is on purpose. Your body does that on purpose. Once you've accumulated body fat, then you don't eat anything. The bear doesn't eat anything. It goes to sleep in its den. But it's cold as hell, and its body fat is now being used to keep it warm and to continue all the biological functions for 3 or 4 months. When it comes out of its den, it didn't lose muscle mass. That would be counterproductive. Nature never sets you up to be counterproductive. Nature sets you up to survive. So when it comes out of its den, it would be detrimental if it lost all its muscle. What it does is it goes, hey, as you get colder, we are going to make you more and more insulin sensitive and more leptin sensitive so that your muscles remain intact. And we burn all this body fat and undo insulin resistance. So when the bear wakes up, it's no longer insulin resistance, even though it clearly was before it went into sleep. So cold exposure for diabetics can function the same way. Some of the things that, because you're not going to be able to just fall asleep for 3 months, some of the things you have to take into consideration is you have to cut carbohydrates down to a minimum so that you don't continue to send the signal of, hey, there are still carbohydrates around, even though it's cold. And then you couple that with cold exposure, you start to train the biology to, hey, it's okay to let go of some of our body fat and use it for heat production because it is in fact cold and this person is not consuming as many carbohydrates. So it must mean that it's winter. So now we can start to undo a lot of the processes that got turned on when insulin resistance started to come on. Now, some of the caveats that you have to consider when starting this. Your omega-3 index is crucial to knowing how well you're going to respond to the cold. Because if your omega-6s are omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is higher than 5 or 6, so it's just a ratio. Ideally, you want to have 4 omega-6s to every 1 omega-3. So a 4-to-1 ratio or just 4. You'll see it on the blood tests. If it's higher than that, you have the potential of running into some unwanted side effects of cold exposure as a diabetic or somebody who's obese or just struggling with those types of things. If your omega-6 ratio is very high, you might, every time you expose yourself to cold, you might end up with like a rash on your skin and almost like tingly and rashy, especially around fingertips and stuff like that. That's a clear sign that your omega-6 ratio is too high because omega-6s interfere with the cold receptors and how body fat gets processed to fuel your body to produce heat. If you have too high of omega-6s, it'll interfere with that and it ends up manifesting as a rash on your skin. So that then goes back to, hey, change your nutritional outcomes a little bit to include more omega-3 fatty fish and start raising. If that were to happen, say I had a client that happened to, that's the first thing I would say. Hey, let's go test your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio because it's not a common test. So doctors don't even really know much about it, but that's where I would go, hey, let's test that. And if it comes back like a 10 or a 12 or a 15, I've literally seen people super fit, super ripped, their omega-3 or omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was like a 16 and all kinds of health problems. And when they would do their cold exposure, they're like, man, it kills me. It makes me ache. It makes me all rash and I break out. It's like, they describe it as like, I'm allergic to the cold. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's go test your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And sure enough, it was way, way, way too high. And depending on how high, it could take a little while to fix. But if your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is like a 5 or ideally a 4, then you're going to be golden and you will actually respond in the opposite way. You almost start to crave the cold. You almost feel like the cold almost gives you superhuman abilities, right? And that's kind of what the Iceman, Wim Hof, describes in a lot of his experiences is, hey, when I expose myself to cold, I think better, I function better, I have a clearer mind, I feel like I can take on the world. That's the type of benefits you'll start to get from cold when your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is properly done. You will only get the benefits. So
what would be
that's
easiest nutritional advice for someone like that to fix it without supplements?
Yeah, so in this case, I would say that supplement, because if your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is that high, it tells me that you're not just deficient in omega-3s, but all the things that come with the fatty fish. That includes selenium, iodine, and those are big, big crucial things because they actually, iodine specifically functions not just as a thyroid precursor, but also as a brain antioxidant. It's actually very powerful for that. So I would say I wouldn't go with supplements very much. I would go if needed, right? at the beginning month, right, to transition to actual fatty fish, I would say I would bring in some selenium, iodine, and fish oil in conjunction with, hey, once a week, I want you to have 4 to 6 ounces of fatty fish. And then over the course of the weeks, ideally we end up like, hey, Monday through Friday or 5 days out of the week, you have one meal a day. So I'm asking for only one meal a day that contains some fatty fish. And that's salmon, herring, mackerel, oysters, clams, cold water seafood are going to contain all of these things in abundance: selenium, iodine, omega-3s, and all the cofactors. It's not very important to mention this, all the cofactors for all of those to get absorbed appropriately.
So
And
what would be your advice in incorporating cold exposure to someone's life now?
Mhm.
Someone is like, hey,
yeah, literally you can start this today. Yep.
Mm.
Yeah, you can start this today. The easiest thing is just go outside. Go outside for 10 minutes in the morning with as little clothing as possible, right? Like, depending on where you live in the neighborhood. Like for me, I literally go outside in my underwear, right? Or even naked sometimes. But with as little clothing as possible, ideally a t-shirt and some short shorts, right? Or just shirtless if you're a man, shirtless with some shorts. For 10 minutes outside in the morning, and you repeat that in the evening. That's the easiest base level to do this right, is just little clothing outside, 10 minutes. For those 10 minutes, I don't care what you're doing. I personally use those 10 minutes to do a little bit of breath work, kind of get my mind right for the day, write down anything that you need to get done immediately so that you can just relax for those 10 minutes and kind of let things go. Because the moment you write things down, you can just quickly pick that up and move on when the 10 minutes are over. At night, it's actually the opposite. You want to compliment yourself. You want to be like, hey, fuck yeah, I checked that off. I killed it today. I did this, pat yourself on the back, because there's nothing you can do, right? It's time to go to bed. It's not a time to like busy yourself. It's a time to be like, hey, I checked off these things. I did these things correctly. Oh, I wanted to do that a little bit better. Let's make a note for tomorrow. I use that a time to like tie up the day, right? And be like, perfect. I have nothing on my mind and I'm outside and I'm relaxing. Then you go back inside. And when you go back inside, this is the only caveat. When you go back inside, you do want to make sure that lighting is dimmed. If you use blue light blocking glasses, I recommend them so that you don't interfere with what you just set yourself up for.
So the summary, it all up, cold exposure is beneficial for pretty much anyone. If you are not physically at your peak performance, you're probably going to benefit from it more than someone who is. If you are at very high kind of performance space, you ideally want to periodize yourself at extreme exposure to cold, or you're going to compromise your ability to keep improving. Is that kind of something that?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. That wording works very, very good, because it helps you make correct decisions along with
and that's with everything we've ever talked about, is make sure it fits where you're at in a globe and how it fits your periodization of your life, training, and everything else.
Yes, absolutely. Yep, you nailed it. That's a great summary of all the things that we talked about there.
No, awesome. Thanks for your time as usual, David, and I'll catch you in the next video.
Awesome.